Huffstodt discuss General Martin Hardin. Now, Hardin's a member of the Walworth family, as we all know, and Jim has been researching Hardin writing the book for about 6 years. You know, Agnes has worked with him intently over the phone, sending him materials. I've helped him with photographs, and we've talked over the phone. And we finally got to meet today in person after 6 years of correspondence. Jim's a resident of Tallahassee, Florida, but he originally grew up in Illinois. He has been a freelance writer and also published a couple other history books, one on the 11th Illinois Infantry, one on, is it Outlaws in the Everglades, Jim?
I can't remember.
But it's about the Everglades. Okay, Everglades Lawman. Because I know when I saw the title, I said, "Wow, this is really interesting. I'd like to read it," and I forgot the title. So, but in any case, he's also a graduate of Illinois and Southern Illinois universities with degrees in history, and he put the history to use to write a history of General Martin Hardin. So, I'd like to introduce Jim Huffstodt.
Now, can everybody hear me? Okay, we'll see if that's good or not as we progress through the evening. First of all, I'd like to just compliment, how many members are here that are volunteers for the museum? Would you raise your hand? We got 1, 2, 3. Well, these people do a marvelous job. What a setting, what a treasure you have here. I was just agog when I came in here. And we received such a warm welcome from Jamie and Agnes. And I want to tell you that a book, there may be one name as the author, but it takes a lot of people. I'm almost going to say it takes a village, but I don't want to go there. It takes a lot of people to write a book. And those of us that love history, and I'm sure that includes all of you, would probably agree. I've found that that's a bond. And as I spent, actually it's closer to 8 years researching his life, which is a labor of love, I met so many people, some physically meeting them, others email and by phone, and almost without exception, they were also generous with their time and their knowledge because they shared that passion. You know, we love history, and we think that it's something that people should remember, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. There's a gentleman here today, I won't single him out, but he'd asked if I was going to have a PowerPoint. Well, I've long ago thrown away the PowerPoint. I have something far more powerful. Technology is nothing compared to this giant engine of creativity. And you all possess it. Even though you might not think you do, you do. Oh, this is my wife over here. I almost forgot to interview her. Oh, am I not talking to the mic? Hold it like this. Okay. All right, I get all excited. And what was I saying? Oh, the powerful engine of creativity. It's called your imagination. And I'm going to ask you to use your imagination. Most of you are no longer a child. But remember when you were a child and you could envision whole worlds? I want you to do that today because we're going back in time. We're going back to a terrible time in American history in 1862 on a battlefield near Manassas, Virginia. Manassas, Virginia. Okay. And you mean well, but when someone says something, then it throws me off track. Amidst the chaos, the fighting had gone on 2 days. And Colonel Martin Hardin of the Pennsylvania Reserves had been leading his regiment in some of the hardest fighting. On the first day of Manassas, this is Second Manassas. It's very near the first Battle of Bull Run, which was a disaster for the Union. The second Battle of the Bull Run was perhaps as bad or close to being as bad a defeat. And That first day, he was leading his men, and it sounds like a bad B movie, but envision a man, an enlisted man, yells out and he says, "Colonel Hardin, duck!" And Hardin turns to talk to him, and a rebel bullet grazes his head and his ear and rips off part of his cap. His first wound of 4 in the war. He is, at that time, a 26-year-old man, and he's leading a regiment of perhaps 1,000 men. On the second day, the brigade commander, who leads 4 regiments, 4 to 5,000 men, has some heart issues, gives up his command, and he turns to Hardin, a West Pointer, to lead his men at a crucial point in the battle. Strangely enough, the commanding general of the Army, John Pope of Illinois, was convinced that he had an opportunity to destroy Jackson's corps, which was isolated from the rest of Lee's army. However, many, including Hardin, realized that the longer they assaulted Jackson's corps, which was entrenched behind an unfinished railroad embankment, the rest of Lee's army was coming up from the south and would strike them in the flank. The division commander, John Reynolds, ordered his men to guard this exposed flank. Again, the top brass said, "No, we need every man to finish off Jackson." They were on there. All of a sudden, Jackson's corps appeared, led by Hood's Texans, very ferocious fighters. Hardin, without orders, he was now, remember, half hour ago he was a regimental commander. Now this 26-year-old is leading 5,000 men. He doesn't ask for permission. He turns his men around. He talks with an artillery commander who has a battery, and they set up a defense. As the rebels come out of the woods, New York regiments, Zouave regiments, who were dressed in a very colorful outfit with red pantaloons and blue, envision this in your mind, are running away, throwing their weapons away. And in case you don't know, all soldiers, the bravest of soldiers, will run if the situation is such. Hardin and this artillery commander tried to hold them up. A vicious battle occurred. In the midst of it, Hardin again was turning, and a rebel rifle bullet hit him in the chest and traversed the front of his rib cage, missing the lungs and coming out through his left upper arm. Excuse me. Okay. Pardon me. In the midst of this carnage, some infantrymen carried him back. One of the general's aides gave him a drink of whiskey, which he later said saved his life. He went back. They took him to Washington in the shambles of another defeat. His brother, Lemuel Hardin, both of these boys grew up here, were well known, played on one of the first baseball teams here, well liked. And Lemuel contacted Chancellor Walworth, his stepfather, who had come to really love these boys, these Hardin boys, and their sister, Ellen, who married one of his sons. And essentially, he said he's bringing Martin home to Saratoga Springs to die. Well, he came here and he was nursed at Walworth's home, which no longer exists. And somehow, he survived. 9 months the recovery took. And there's a letter, a poignant letter his mother wrote, talking about how Martin had come back from New York where he'd been talking to some surgeons. And there were particles of bone working out of his left arm. His left arm was useless. It just hung by his side. You can see him in a picture. He's now a full-bird colonel, I think. And his left arm, you can see, it's just hanging there. He rejoins his men. They're on the march to Gettysburg. Remember, these are Pennsylvania reserves. They'd suffered in many battles, but their state was being invaded, and they were motivated. Well, Hardin was in no condition to join them. They were on the march a day, and suddenly, through the dusk, comes riding up their colonel. Throughout his career, he never left his men if he could avoid it. He was a man of integrity, a man of honor. Those are words that, I think have been abused in the last 40 or 50 years, but certainly they were very apt, very accurate in talking about this man. They went to Gettysburg, and he watched from the big hill. They didn't know anything about Little Round Top or Big Round Top. There was a little hill, the big hill. And he watched as Pickett's charge went by. Or at least he watched part of it because they were taking sniper fire at the time. This man seemed to be everywhere. Now, he had received 2 wounds, one very seriously. The campaigns of 1863 ended. The winter was approaching. And he was put in command of 3 regiments to repair the railroad leading to Washington. And it was in John Mosby's country. John Mosby was a Confederate guerrilla. You really had to be on your best. You had to be on alert because he was a devious, clever man. And anyway, Hardin and his staff were riding along the railroad line deciding where to put blockhouses when they noticed 4 or 5 Union cavalrymen in Union blue riding up. And Hardin rode up to them and said, "What unit are you?" Well, they were riding with their left side to him, their left hands in the reins of the horses. They wheeled their horses as if on command, where they had revolvers. They were Confederate raiders, and they opened fire. Various accounts. In one account, Hardin withdrew his sword and slashed one of the attackers. I'm not sure if that happened, but one of the attackers did grab Hardin's hat and took it as a trophy. Hardin was wounded in that same arm, and it was shattered. This time, again, he went to the hospital. He was beloved by his division commander, General Crawford. General Crawford wrote a letter to Mrs. Walworth, Hardin Walworth, and the Chancellor, and he said he had obtained the best surgeons to work on him. Mrs. Walworth, Sarah Hardin Walworth, went down there by train. She found him in the Washington hospital, and she wrote the Chancellor. She said, "I found Martin. It's a matter of time. He's going. He's going away from us." Again, second time he'd been wounded, almost dying. Somehow he recovered. 10 days later, Mrs. Hardin, who was a remarkable woman, Hardin Walworth, you have to remember that she and her first husband, John Hardin of Illinois, were close friends of the Lincolns in Springfield. They both were Whig congressmen. They were friends. They were political allies. At one point, Lincoln went to Congress, and John Hardin went to the Mexican War, where he died a hero. Lincoln afterwards felt he owed the family something, and he proved that on several occasions. Somehow, her young son, Martin, recovered again. That was his 3rd wound. Within 10 days, she wrote President Lincoln, and she said, "My son has lost his arm. He's been wounded 3 times in the service. And I noticed that next month, there will be vacancies announced for Brigadier General. I think it'd be appropriate if he was promoted. This woman, in an age when most women stayed at home, didn't. And she was, in effect, a lobbyist. She spent most of the war in Washington. And frankly, she was working on behalf of her son. And she was very good at it. She didn't fight battles or skirmishes, but in tea parties and cotillions. She was there at the first inaugural ball with Reuben Walworth. That's where she did her work. And when I began my research on Martin Hardin, Professor Joe Knetch, Florida State University history professor, he told me, he says, you check the political angle. He said, because these generals, some were very good, some weren't. But they almost always had a political patron. Things haven't changed a lot, have they? And she, with her connections to the Lincoln family, acted as his lobbyist and patron. So he was quite the guy. By the way, when he learned, he was in a school, he was 13 years old, north of Peoria, in a boarding school, when he got a letter from his mother, and this was in, I think, 1850. His father had been dead for 3 or 4 years. And his mother told him, I have met a man in Louisville, Kentucky. We've only known each other for a day. His name is Chancellor Reuben Walworth. He is a man of distinction, achievement, and good character, and we're going to marry. And young Martin, is what he said later, recorded, he decided he would run off to the far west because he didn't want anything to do with this man. Ironically, he came to love and respect Chancellor Walworth. They had a good relationship. He came here and he was 14, and he almost died here in Saratoga Springs. He was a child of the southern Illinois prairie. He was used to hunting, fishing, very capable. And often, when he wasn't in school, he would grab some bread and a little meat and his rifle and some fishing line, and he would head up out into the hills here. And one time he did that. He set up a campfire, and some men approached him. And they said, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm just camping out, you know. And he said, let me see your rifle. And the boy handed this man the rifle. The man grabbed it by the stock and smashed it over Hardin's head. And he said he doesn't remember much of that until the next morning when these men drove up to Chancellor Walworth's home with young Hardin in the back of the wagon bleeding. There was no explanation of the attack, why this occurred. It was just a blatant act of aggression. But despite that terrible incident, he loved Saratoga Springs, and he loved the Walworths. And he was a good man. Many people have asked me, you spent 8 years researching the life of an obscure Union general. Why would you spend all those hours doing that? And there's probably no real answer. What was it? Sir Edmund Hillary was asked, why do you climb Mount Everest? And he said, because it's there. And in a way, that's a profound statement. But I can tell you this. I was reading a book called Generals in Blue, which is really a reference work by Ezra Warner 35 years ago. And I'm going to read you a passage from that. And this really ignited a lifetime ambition to tell this man's story. So if you'll pardon me, I'm going to step over here. And this is what Warner wrote in 1964. Hardin embarked upon a combat career in the Civil War, which has few parallels in the annals of the Army for gallantry, wounds sustained, and the obscurity into which he had lapsed a generation before his death. Now remember, this is a man who fought at Gettysburg, who suffered 4 wounds, who had fought at other key battles, who was a protégé of General Lincoln, who was assigned command of the northern defenses of Washington in the last year of the war, visited the president on many occasions. He was somebody. And I thought, we need to remember people like this. Not because he was a military genius or that he was, if he hadn't lived, the North still would have won the Civil War. But he represents the kind of American that has built this country. There are many Martin Hardins, and today too. Unfortunately, I think changing culture, we don't give them the recognition they need to have. So this impelled me. I wanted this man to be remembered. And that was the beginning of a journey that led me here to Saratoga Springs, through Agnes and Jamie, to the Chicago Historical Society, to St. Augustine, Florida. How many have been to St. Augustine, Florida? Okay. General Hardin is buried there with his second wife in the military cemetery. When he died, they lived, after the war, let me explain, he was a prominent Chicago attorney. They did very well. He was a retired brigadier general. They knew all the right people. And in the winter, starting in 1885, he would spend the winter in St. Augustine, originally in a modest little second floor cottage. That's still there. You can see that. His first wife died. A few years later, he made a very good move. He married a woman who was more than 20 years younger than he, and she was heiress to the McLaughlin coffee fortune. So they moved from that little place, and now they stayed at the Ponce de Leon, and later they leased what's called the Union General's home, because 2 Union generals lived there after the war. One was General Schofield, the second was General Hardin, and that's where General Hardin died. Also, if you go to St. Augustine and you go to the Catholic mission, which is called the Mission Nombre de Dios, the name of God, and that is the site of the first Mass celebrated by the Spanish. There's a little chapel there. It had been damaged in a windstorm. After Hardin's death in 1923, his wife, his widow, restored that chapel, landscaped it. She brought in a statue of St. Martin of Tours and commissioned the chapel essentially in memorial to her husband. And if you go down there, you can see that. The Catholic angle, and some of you may be aware of this, Chancellor Walworth's son, Clarence, broke away from Protestantism and became a Roman Catholic priest. Not just a run-of-the-mill priest. He was one of the founders of the Paulist order. He was a great speaker who converted many Americans to the Catholic faith, including his own family, and eventually Hardin. I really wanted to find out when he brought Hardin into that religion, and I learned that over 12, 13 years, Hardin did not change. In fact, when his sister, Ellen, who later founded the DAR, announced her faith, he was very upset. But by the time of the war, in 1863, he converted. I believe that it happened right after his third wound, where he lost his arm. Now you would think, with an arm gone, with a terrible wound here, a close call that would be the end. And if you read the documentation as I did, there was a period where Hardin was considering that. But for some reason, he went back again and joined his men in the final move on Richmond when Grant had taken over. And he fought at Spotsylvania. He fought at North Anna. He fought at a place called Bethesda Church. And then he went to Washington, and that was where Lincoln promoted him to Brigadier General, age 28. His mother wrote a letter to Chancellor Walworth here, and she says, "For most of the war, I have been here in Washington, and finally I have achieved my aim. Martin has received his star, a small compensation for the suffering that he has gone through and what he's done for his country." All right. Those forts had not been attacked through the whole war. Washington at that time was the most heavily fortified city in the world. When Grant moved south, he was now near Cold Harbor and moving south. He stripped those forts of troops. He wanted every soldier he could get. This is the summer of '64. Hardin commanded all the forts on the north bank of the Potomac. Many of his men were, like Hardin, invalids. There was something called the Invalid Corps. By the way, they changed the name. Somebody said, "Gee, this doesn't sound good," because they were all either sick or wounded. Let's call it the Veteran Reserve Corps. So things haven't changed there either, but they were the Invalid Corps. He had 3-month Ohio National Guardsmen, the Invalid Corps. He had something called the District of Columbia Militia, which was led by a grocer. These were not frontline troops. There were not enough of them. Lee, daring as always, sent General Early with an army north with the idea to threaten to Washington. Hardin had been promoted a week before. This should have been a sinecure. You've paid your debts. Here, go to Washington, call a formation, make sure the guys get fed, enjoy the city. A week later, there's an army marching on Washington. Hardin is in command. He's 27 years old, and they're coming. And all the African American refugees in the city, I'm not going to say all, but many are panic-stricken because they fear that they will be thrown back into slavery, or worse, if the Confederates take the capital. Remember, Grant has left. So Hardin is mobilizing these men, the crippled. Some of the men moving to his forts couldn't walk there. They came by wagon. He did not have a force. But what he did, and not by himself, they had a lot more generals than privates. In fact, General Halleck received a telegram in the midst of this crisis as the Confederates are advancing, and a general in New York said, you send me a telegram and I'll be there in hours. And he said, "We have plenty of generals, but if you come as a private with a rifle, you're welcome." He didn't come for some reason. Well, that first night, they're waiting for the rebels to come. And the word was they would attack Hardin's forts on the western approaches to Washington. And Hardin went up into a tower with a signalman, and they could see them approaching. His thought was, we can't even man the trenches. They're empty. If the Confederates push hard, and these are veteran troops, Hardin again and again talked about the Army of Northern Virginia. Said these are the best soldiers in the world. And I'm supposed to defend Washington with wounded men, sick men, old men? But he did the best he could, and he made a noise, he made a show. So he ordered his men in the forts to move around in front of the embrasures, where the cannon would put out, so you'd have people going back and forth. So if you're a Confederate cavalryman and you're out there looking through your binoculars, you see all this activity, and then you see a column of men marching behind there. It's the same column marching back and forth, but you don't know that. And then he takes his cannon, these huge cannon, 100-pound pair guns, and fires them. And by golly, the Confederate cavalry commander, Tiger McCausland, reports to General Early and says, this area of the fort, the line is heavily held. Now that campaign is very complex. The focus of the Confederate attack, or really was a feeling out, heavy skirmishing, moved to a different area of the fortresses, and eventually Early withdrew. 25 years later, Hardin wrote a paper for the military order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, former Union officers. And in it, he said there was a 30-hour period where the Capitol could have fallen. If Early had been Jackson, all they had to do was push through. What would that happen? This is July 1864. What was coming up? The elections, November 1864. How would that have affected the election? Lincoln leaves the Capitol, flees the Capitol, which is burned. We've been fighting this war 3 years, and the Capitol is burned. The Treasury has been looted, and the Confederates have marched away. Who knows? Now, there are historians who say that it never would have happened. But it's one of those ifs, and Hardin was there. Hardin was everywhere. He moved to Chicago as a lawyer. Chicago burned down. You know, I'll tell you, I wouldn't get on a ship with him. He was always there, and he had such a colorful life. Where is my timekeeper here?
I've been listening.
Oh, well, usually, I used to speak to a lot of groups at retirement communities in Florida. I worked for the Florida Fish and Wildlife. And normally it was about 9:30 in the morning, and they'd just eaten breakfast. And the average age was probably 68, 75. And I eventually decided that once half the audience was asleep, it was time to wrap it up. And the other thing I noticed, and I'll share this with you, is the ones that were really asleep, the ones that were sound asleep, when it came time for me to leave, they would wake up and they applauded more enthusiastically than anybody. They loved it. Oh, I loved your talk. And I haven't seen but maybe 10 people fall asleep tonight. So we're doing pretty good. And one of them was my wife, but she hears me all the time. How are we doing?
Just a few more minutes.
A few more minutes. We need to wrap up. Will we have time for questions, or should I? So anyway, you know, these are bits and pieces of Hardin's life. And when Lincoln died, Hardin was there in Washington. He was very close to the president. There's one letter that indicates that. On, I believe it was the 17th. He was killed on the 14th, shot on the 14th, died on the 15th. Anyway, within a few days, the president's body is still being prepared. They're building the catafalque in the White House. Now, true, Hardin's a brigadier general. In Washington in 1865, brigadier generals were like bellhops. I mean, there were a lot of them. Where was Hardin? He was in the White House. And I'm going to read you the letter that he wrote his mother, Sarah Hardin Walworth of Saratoga Springs, that day in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, an event that had paralyzed the country. Again, excuse me, 1 second. Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., April 17th, 1865. By this time, the entire city was covered in black mourning. People were crying on the streets. They couldn't believe it. The news of Lee's surrender had been only days before, with mad celebration, bonfires in the streets, fireworks. Now, Lincoln was dead. Hardin in the White House writes, "My dear mother, here in the presence of the mighty dead, I write you these few lines. Our good, honest president is dead, just as he was making peace throughout our unfortunate country. He is taken from us by the fanatical hand of the assassin. Oh, how I shall pray that our country may not be again the scene of fratricidal strife. I am sick at heart. The investigations have disclosed so much villainy. It's impossible to tell what to expect next. Oh, Mother, what sad, sad times we live in. Truly yours, love and haste, M.D. Hardin." There's also a passage that sums up the general. He died at 86, and that's part of what attracted me to his life. Here's a man that as a boy rode steamboats, participated in steamboat races, who before the Civil War went out to the far west and saw the great Indian cultures in their twilight, the Nez Perce, the Sioux, the Cheyenne. He lived an adventurous life in a time of enormous change. By the time he died in St. Augustine in 1923, there were silent films, automobiles, airplanes. What a different world. Talk about Rip Van Winkle waking up. What happened? What happened? Well, one of his friends wrote a memorial for the West Point Association. His name was Major General William Harding Carter, June 11, 1924. The passing of General Martin D. Hardin removes from the rolls of the Army a distinguished and altogether unique figure. He came of fighting ancestry. His great-grandfather, John Hardin, commanded a company in Daniel Morgan's celebrated Regiment of Virginia Riflemen at the Battle of Saratoga. General Hardin's grandfather, after whom he was named, was a co-laborer with Henry Clay in the effort to make Kentucky a free state, and they lost by a narrow margin. The grandfather served under General Harrison in the War of 1812. General Hardin's father was killed while serving with Zachary Taylor in the fiercely contested Battle of Buena Vista. General Hardin's father and Abraham Lincoln were close friends, had served together in the war with Black Hawk's Indian warriors. When General Hardin's father was killed in battle in Mexico, Mr. Lincoln took a fatherly interest in the son, which continued until the day of his own assassination. So that's why I spent 8 years researching the life of this man. Thank you for your attention, and if anyone has questions, we'll do our best to answer them. No hard questions, though, just easy questions. Oh, I know you. You don't ask easy questions. Okay.
How did he end up getting with the Pennsylvania Regiment?
Well, he originally was an artillery officer serving in Washington, and he was with the regular army. There were the volunteers, the regular army. Pennsylvania Reserve Division was one of the few divisions that was from one single state. And his artillery battery was with them early, and he made friends. And he was ambitious, and it was much easier to make rank commanding infantry than artillery. So that was the the main reason. Okay, yes, sir.
This is actually a question about General about the time period. Regarding the assassination, what are your thoughts on the Booth escape conspiracy theories? Historians say that Booth was killed at Garrett Farm 11 days later, but there's also theories that Booth escaped with in 1903.
Well, you're asking about an area I certainly don't consider myself that knowledgeable about. I will tell you this about Hardin. Remember when he was ambushed by Mosby's guerrillas? One of the men that shot him later was revealed to be one of the Lincoln conspirators, Payne. Payne, who almost stabbed Secretary of Seward to death. Again, right in the wake of the assassination, General Hardin escorted Fanny Seward, who was witness to the attack, 16-year-old girl, and her brother Augustus, who'd been wounded in the attack. If you've read about that, it's incredible. bloody incident. Seward survived by a miracle. They wanted another witness to say, this is the man that attacked your father. This young girl was brought aboard an ironclad, and down in the depths of the ironclad, they brought up Payne, who was in chains. Hardin was there. Fanny said, I don't know. I don't know if it was him. The brother said, that's him. I know it was him. And there had been a previous identification. They left. However, Payne became very friendly with one of his jailers. And he told him, he says, you know that Union officer? He says, I know him. And he says, you do? He says, yeah, I shot him outside Catlin Station, Virginia. There is a picture, and it's in the book. A fellow researcher examined the scene at the gallows where they hanged 4 Lincoln conspirators, including Payne and a woman, Surratt, Mary Surratt. And he wrote me and sent me the picture, and he said, this to me on the wall looks like General Hardin. And it's a one-armed officer. He's wearing a straw hat. He's got a mustache. Was that Hardin? I'm not sure. It could have been, maybe it wasn't. But it's interesting. Did he go down there to see his assailant hanged? Maybe he did. Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Yes. You said people asked you why you followed this up because you wanted to bring it back to life and show what you did.
Mhm.
I feel like, well, I believe the soul lives on anyway. How it's done. So I feel like we're led to do these things. For instance, I never heard of Saratoga Springs before. I lived in Syracuse. I was born in Portland, New York. And my father went to Portland State for history. And I remember I wanted to be a singer. And my father pounded his head on the table and said, no daughter of mine's going to be in any kind of show business. And we were going to go to college. I said, I won't go to college. You know? He said, and you don't like history, you learn from history. You learn from history, and history repeats itself. And I remember it like him pounding, and he's a high. I'm a high. I'm a distant cousin from Reuben. And I didn't know that. My daughter, my oldest daughter, lived up here, and I thought, what a cute little town up here to visit. I ended up moving here and doing my genealogy because my father was killed in an accident. I started it in '69. Excuse me. And Reuben Walworth did all the genealogy all the way down to my great-grandfather Chauncey, who my brother's named after. And I never knew the man's name. I just know my father said, I am a distant cousin of the Chancellor of Education for the state of New York. He will go to college. And so I remember, and it's like, this must be the man, because I never knew his name. And it turned out to be Reuben. So I feel we are led by people, and that's why we do these things.
Perhaps so. When I was speaking, did you hear the tinkling piano? Now you do realize that that is the piano that Reuben Walworth brought back from the First World's Fair in London for his wife, Sarah Hardin Walworth. And a great pianist, Gottschalk, came to the home and played. Now, I have no doubt that was him playing right now.
Somebody led you to do this. Somebody had to do this. Like, I couldn't prevent was a single child.
Perhaps you're right.
I did it.
Uh,
Reuben Walworth. I didn't even know he was here. I was told at the library, we have a copy of the right page in Glenn's Falls. So I had the librarian get me a copy to follow up, and he proved my entire genealogy.
Well, that's a very interesting story. Let me just finish my comment about the piano. It may be the ghost of Gottschalk playing that piano, but it may also be what happened in the 1880s when Rubina, who later died as a nurse in the Spanish-American War, and her nurse, Dolly Smith, a former slave, heard the piano being played, and it terrified both of them. However, later it turned out it was a mouse running up inside the... So that may have been a mouse. I don't know. You never know. Do we have time for one more question? Oh, here it comes.
Mentioned Lemuel. Lemuel was his younger brother?
Yes, 3 years.
Did he serve during the war?
Yes, he did, for the Confederates. Right.
Were the brothers in contact at all during that period of...
You know, I often tell people, when you're doing research, in a way it's like an archaeologist, and you're uncovering an artifact. Say it's a mosaic that's hundreds of years old, and you dust it off, and there are pieces that are missing. And you hope you get the whole picture. There's very little about what went on in that family, about the war. I could tell you this, Chancellor Walworth, he either turned Lemuel's picture against the wall or removed it when he went south. Actually, Ellen, there's some questionable... she seemed to be in sympathy with the South herself. She was in contact with rebel prisoner officers at Johnson Island, sent them food, sent them clothing. Now, was this simply a humanitarian gesture, or did it reflect her politics? She lived in neutral Kentucky throughout the war. Not neutral Kentucky, the border state of Kentucky. And the Hardins, for those of you that don't know, even though Ellen and her brother and Lemuel were born in Jacksonville, Illinois, that family was from Kentucky. And they were Kentuckians. And they knew their family history. And young Hardin said when he grew up, he knew that Yankees were contemptible, money-grubbing, and cowards. That was, you know, everybody knew that. So he was a Southerner. So that family, and that was something that attracted me to this. Here's a family. The country is torn in half. The Hardin Walworth family was torn in half. His brother-in-law Mansfield was arrested as a Confederate spy and thrown in the old Capitol prison for 4 months. His brother fought for the Confederacy. And you wonder, I wish I were a great novelist, because there's a story there. The facts, at least I couldn't find the facts. But somebody with a good imagination, I think, could write a great story about that, what that family went through. All I can tell you is that there's a picture taken in Chicago. It's on the back of my book. They're all reunited. And of course, you can't see it, but Martin Hardin had lost an arm, severely wounded. His brother Lemuel has a cane. He'd been shot in the leg. He was a cripple the rest of his life. He died out in San Diego in 1909, apparently due to that Civil War wound, which wasn't necessarily uncommon. General Chamberlain, if you saw the Gettysburg movie, he died in 1913 in his 80s, but it was from his wounds. You know, incredible. You've been a great audience, and thank you so much